Hear me okay? Thank you, Zoom. Yeah, so my name's Shaaron Ainsworth. As Cameron said, I'm a professor at the University of Nottingham. And I have been fascinated for the last 30 or so years about how we learn through representation. So as a species, it's one of the two things really that make us unique. We learn by forming connections with one another. So we have a kind of mutual intersubjectivity in my jargon. But the other thing we do is we learn by creating representations that teach ourselves and others, when we're not here. And we've been doing this for about 50,000 years. And I think that's just absolutely fascinating and unique and wonderful. And I've been trying to study this and understand it for 30 years. And so I'm delighted to be here tonight because there are so many communities that are relevant to this area, and you can never find all of them, and you stumble across a new community or a new paper or a new conference, and you're suddenly down a new rabbit hole of new ways of thinking about how representations help us learn. So I really hope there'll be some time for questions today so that I can kind of learn from your perspectives on data visualization. And I wish I had turned my email off because it's going like crazy in the background. Drat. So let me begin. So this is the sort of thing that I have studied for the last, 25, 30 years. I've studied, graphs and charts. I've studied timelines. I've studied phylogenetic trees. I've studied students learning from textbooks. And more recently, for sort of the last 10 years or so, I've sort of moved away from this area. And I've moved to, my little data stick really doesn't want to work. Oh, maybe it does. I've moved to these kind of things. So I've moved to the drawings that students create themselves as they learn. And as Cameron said, I'm interested in grade school to graduate school. So today, I probably won't be drawing on many areas that you are currently working on. So hopefully you can take some of the things and port it into your area of interest. But my interests span from getting 5-year-olds to draw to people studying what I consider quite advanced quantum mechanics because it confuses me. So, and everything in between. So that's what I'm going to really try and talk about today. And that's what is unique for learning when you draw a visualization for yourself, rather than look at one that somebody has constructed for you. And so I better define what I mean here. So I'm talking about the construction of a static visual representation by the learner themselves. And I'm talking about a situation when the construction is intended to be meaningful. So one time I wrote a paper, not dissimilar to the talk I'm giving today, and I published it in Science, which is a huge deal for an academic. And it was, an immense moment of pride. But then Science press released it as doodling to learn. And my paper had nothing to do with doodling. Doodling here is quite interesting. There is research around whether doodling helps us modulate our cognitive arousal and keeps us more or less absorbed. But that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a meaningful construction. And I'm also talking about a situation where the primary intention is to learn. So I'm not talking about situations where people are trying to artistically express themselves, even though some of the visualizations I'm talking about today will have that form. I'm also not talking about things where your primary intention is to perhaps make a decision quickly and rapidly. I'm here today to think about how drawing helps us understand a complicated new thing in a new way. And I'm also going to be talking about situations where people sketch with traditional tools such as pen and paper. I'm also going to be happily including drawing in my definition when people use a finger on a screen or a tool on a screen. But I don't particularly want to talk about selection from a palette, because for me, whilst there are affordances from selection from a panel, and I wouldn't rule it out as a practice, for me, it doesn't really get to the heart of creating a static visual spatial representation for yourself. And for that, I'm just going to be really broad and really as wide as I can, and just say, for me, a visual spatial representation is one where position and space is meaningful. So it may have some resemblance to a physical artifact, it may not, but it's not arbitrary. The visual form is not arbitrary like it is in language, or almost like it is in language. So, what do I mean by visual spatial? And what do I mean by drawing visual spatial? Well, I think that when we are trying to understand why drawing visual spatial representations are helpful, we can come at this with some relatively well-informed intuitions. So we can be thinking about, well, these things are visual, we can look at them. We can be thinking about, okay, well, visual things help us remember. And we can be perhaps thinking about, well, visual things might make us feel some emotions. They might connect with us, we might engage with them differently. But I would like to talk just slightly too long on this slide, which isn't, in fact, in my view, a visual spatial representation, because actually the position of the words on this slide is basically arbitrary. And I'd like to talk about some of these, because I think what I try to do as a learning scientist is I don't try and look for a single best explanation of why a visual representation or a particular visual representation helps us learn. I try to look at all the explanations that might be relevant for why a visual spatial representation helps us learn. And I'm not part of your community normally, and so I don't know what are your go-to frames of reference that you already know, and then hence I'm boring you rigid by talking about them. But I also don't know the things that this is the first time you've ever heard the word. So I'm very, very well prepared for either somebody to do a kind of move on gesture to me in the camera. Yeah, we know this, Shaaron. Don't talk about Tufty. Or alternatively, come back in the chat later on if I've just moved too fast over things that are complex jargon, if you're coming across them for the first time. So when I think about why visual representation helps us learn, before I started to think about why constructing one helps us learn, I have to use all these kind of psychological constructs. So I might be thinking about perceptual processes. We can look at them. All sorts of things go on when we look at diagrams and particular forms of diagrams. So I'll be looking at Gestalt theories. I might be talking about the way that color is pre-attentively processed, but not processed well in our periphery. You know, I would be talking about how when we group something on a screen, perceptual inferences become much more easy. So I would be talking about perception. And from what I have seen of your community, you are well versed in understanding some of the perceptual aspects of visual representation. In my particular local community, there's quite an emphasis on short-term and long-term memory in relation to visual representations. So we know when we construct a visual representation, we offload some of our cognition onto the world. We no longer have to keep so much in our minds as we look at it, because it's now out there and it's externalized. So it reduces the demands on our limited capacity working memories. And we've also known for a very long time that visual representations are stored in long-term memory and are re-experienced and re-simulated as we look at them. So I couldn't imagine talking about visual representations without talking about memory. But I also couldn't imagine talking about them without talking about specificity. And specificity, I think, is less well known as a term, but you might know it by another term. So semioticians might talk about depiction here, for example. And by specificity, what I simply mean is visual representations compel us to make commitments to form in a way that verbal language often doesn't. So if I were to ask everybody right now to draw the sentence, "The knife is by the fork," you would have to make commitments to certain decisions that you might not necessarily want to. So of course you'd have to say whether the knife is to the left of or to the right of the fork, but you'd also have to say how many prongs were on the fork and how long the prongs were relative to the handle of the fork, and whether the knife was serrated. And so when we look at visual representations, from Euler circles to Venn diagrams to pictures and photographs, they often, or indeed animations, they often have a kind of form of specificity. They constrain us because they force us to make these commitments to what we're looking at. And that can have disadvantages. So it's very difficult to express disjunctions or abstractions sometimes with visual representations, but it can also have real advantages as well. So I'd be talking about that. I'd be talking about affect and motivation. So, I spend a lot of time with relatively young learners, and, it helps bring home the importance of affect and motivation. But part of my day job is also designing serious games. And one of the things that the games community has really helped us do is think about the importance of affect in how it encourages us to engage for the long term with representations. I'd be talking about motor processes. So there's a very strong interest in my world right now on embodied cognition and how we gesture to representations, how we draw representations, and how the representations we look at evoke motor processes that help us understand the world and remember the world. So there's a whole other talk on gesturing and gesturing over visualizations that we haven't got time for today. I have given this particular slide as an 8-hour seminar, and I promise not to put you through that today. What else would I be talking about? I'd be talking about attention. So visual representations capture our attention. They help sustain attention. Movement, for example, is something that captures our attention whether we would like it to or not. I would be talking about reasoning. I would be talking about how particular forms of problem solving are supported by particular kind of visual representations, but not just problem solving, but narratives and other forms of story-based reasoning. And I would be talking about metacognition. So one of the things we know is that some representations encourage an illusion of understanding. So if you ever put an animation or a video on in a school classroom, or indeed a graduate seminar, you'll find that students often just sit back in their chair, ready to be entertained. And this is something we've known since the 80s, that sometimes representations, they don't encourage us to invest the effort that we need in order to understand them well. But also sometimes when we act well with them, they can support our own understanding of what we do and don't understand. So they're not good for metacognition or bad for metacognition. We just have to help us think about how visual representations help us think about our thinking. Sorry, that's a very meta way of describing it. And I couldn't be doing any of this without thinking about cultural practice. So fundamentally, I've said that these don't have any meaning where I put them on the slide, and they don't. But if I were to commit to one kind of enveloping everything, I would be talking about how cultural and social practices are sort of fundamental to visual representations. I would say they allow us to express our understanding with one another, and we can't act on them without understanding the culture and the social context they come from. So if I had to commit to the biggest, most important word of all on this slide, I'd say it's culture. So the representations that we will look at today, some of them have their roots and our explanations of where they come from have our roots in sort of 10,000 years ago. Others we might be inventing tomorrow. So I'll come back to this in questions, because I recognize there was so much jargon and things that make a lot of sense to me that possibly didn't altogether make a lot of sense. So but I'll move on for now. And what I'll say is, for the rest of the talk, I'm not going to mention any single one of these words again. Well, I will, but I won't focus on any single one of these words, because when I'm going to talk about why we draw to learn, I'm always thinking about all of them. I don't, for me, say we should draw to learn because of memory, we should draw to learn because of metacognition, we should draw to learn because of emotion. I think we should draw to learn for all of this, pretty much all of the time. So that's why they're there for me and why they're so central. So the second part, why should you construct one of these visual representations for yourself? Well, I'm a big tent and broad church kind of person. I'm not looking for one reason to draw. And I do think sometimes psychologists, and I have a lot of psychology in my background, we can sometimes go out there to do studies to answer, what's the best reason to draw, or when should we draw? And I think I start from the premise that there isn't one answer to that question. There isn't one best way to draw. There isn't one best time to draw. So I'm trying to talk today about the big tent of drawing and all the reasons we might draw a visual spatial representation for ourselves. And to organize, therefore, what could be a massive complexity of things like the last slide, I'm actually going to borrow somebody else's framework. So I'm going to borrow a framework by Mickey Chi and Ruth Wiley called ICAP. And ICAP stands for Interactive, Constructive, Active, and Passive. And they developed this framework to try and explain cognitive engagement. So they looked at all the things that learners do when they learn and said, essentially, what we want is more cognitive engagement, because that leads to better learning outcomes for all sorts of reasons. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to nick it, and I'm going to use it to explain why drawing can help us learn. And Chi and Wiley were basically looking for how we could maximize engagement. And I'm not going to quite do that. What I'm going to say is you can't draw passively in this definition, because to be passive is simply to be oriented towards receiving information, to be kind of sitting there with your arms folded, not intending to do anything. But the minute you are drawing, you are making some extra overt motor or physical action, and hence you are being active in their terminology. When you are being constructed, you generate or produce externalized outputs that go beyond the information you have been given in some way. So you add something of yourself, something of your prior knowledge, some transformation. And finally, you can be interactive using their terminology. And interactive for them is a way of being dialogic. And it's a particular form of dialogue where both partners' utterances are already constructive. So you're already doing all of that good stuff of going beyond the information given, but you're doing so with a large degree of turn taking. So somebody isn't doing what I'm doing right now and dominating the discourse. We're sharing the discourse, like we will hopefully later in the Q&A. So I'm going to steal their framework and I'm going to apply it to thinking about why we should draw. And off we go with lots of pictures. So I think the first reason to draw is to just basically integrate your relevant prior knowledge with the current situation. Because while you're storing this new information, you are doing things like activating relevant prior knowledge. You're helping to focus your attention. And we know that it helps you remember. So these kind of things look like this. So this for me is not activation of prior knowledge, but it is for my junior level physicist studying quantum mechanics. So at the beginning of a complex series of lessons on, well, complex to me, on, I don't know, time dependence and the infinite well and all sorts of things that I barely understand, that asked to sketch familiar representations that they've already encountered, just to kind of get that representational form that they might have been working on for a year back into their working memory, back into their active knowledge. it's not a new thing, they're just reconstructing their prior knowledge. And that's one good way to draw. We know that when we're learning, activating relevant prior knowledge is really helpful. There does seem to be evidence that a visual form of that is particularly helpful. We can also activate not just kind of a previously studied representation, but previously studied information. So in this particular study, which I did with some colleagues, we were getting doctors right at the beginning of medical school when they were training in their first month or so of human anatomy to draw the external features of the human heart prior to whole body dissection. So we were asking them to draw what they thought the human heart looked like before they went and had a look at a human heart for real. And what you see here is a very typical kind of 19-year-old, bright 19-year-old's understanding of what the heart looks like. So they've got the Latin on there, they're using the canonical forms, but the heart in situ is not shaped like this. This is not what your heart looks like. So we wanted them to kind of activate their relevant prior knowledge before they went and had a look at a human heart and saw how it flattens out to sit on the diaphragm. We also draw often to focus attention. So, since the 1850s, we've known that a pencil is one of the best eyes. It's a statement for kind of biology and natural history. So we know that when people have to look closely at something in order to draw it for themselves, they really have to focus their attention. And again, this could be something that you're looking at or experiencing in the world, but it could also be a data visualization itself. So, I know that some of you have an interest in how you teach data visualization. And one of the things that I do when I'm helping students understand visual representations and their features for the first time is I just ask them to sketch what they're looking at. Now, I don't think that's sufficient for them to learn about it, but what we can see is what they miss. So this person, for example, didn't label these y-axis. So we can see they're not fully focusing their attention on the visual representation that the simulation was showing them. So, I can come in as a teacher, and also the learner can then compare their visualization to the one they're being presented with and notice the things that they've missed out, because that might reveal that there's things they haven't really understood about this visualization. And we've long known, so sort of back to the days of Pavio, who's a very famous cognitive psychologist, that if you ask people to recall something, if they draw a picture of it, rather than form a mental image of it or read a definition of it or just try and remember the word, if they actually draw a very, very brief sketch of it, such as these unfamiliar terms like stratoscope, they'll remember it better, they'll remember it longer, and they're likely to remember the source of the information. And this, these studies were done originally in the 1960s, and there's just been a huge new set of studies confirming that drawing really does help you recall the things that you've learned previously. Now, all of those to me are active drawing, because active drawing doesn't ask you to go beyond what you were presented with. It just asks you to do an accurate, faithful depiction of something. And I think there are success criteria for active drawing, and they're going to be different when we look at these other examples. So it's got to be relevant, but it shouldn't take too long. It's got to be easily achievable. It's got to be quick to complete. If it's going to succeed, learners are going to need minimal scaffolding. They're going to want to get on with this, and it should have high accuracy for its intended purpose. So of course, if you're just sketching a mnemonic to help you remember, it needn't be a faithfully drawn, highly accurate thing. But if you're sketching a graph of quantum mechanics, then it does need to be. So it has to be accurate for its intended purpose, not low or not low or high in accuracy. Right, so let's move on. And I think hopefully this is sort of more the kind of world that you may be in more frequently. And this is my favorite area of drawing as well. And that's when we draw to construct, when we draw to make new inferences. So this is when we're drawing to create a visualization that goes beyond the information we're given. And my catchphrase for this, if I ever get myself a t-shirt, it's going to be, drawing does not simply externalize what learners have in mind. Drawing changes your mind. So when you put something out there and then you inspect it and then you transform it from one form to another, I think you understand something in a way that's very difficult to do if you haven't transformed your understanding and then given yourself the opportunity to look at it and think about what it means. So I'm going to look at 3 examples for how we can construct a visual spatial representation that goes beyond the information that we're given. So the most common thing that psychologists have studied is when you ask people to read text and create a drawing from this sketch. So it could be any kind of form of visual spatial representation. Often people will create relatively abstract depictions here. So certainly graphs and tables are quite often seen when you ask people to draw from text. And on the whole, the meta-analyses at the moment suggest that though there is a wide range of effectiveness, so when we compare drawing to either imaging or reading or looking at a visualization that somebody else has constructed for us, depending on what we're comparing drawing to, it's either a little bit better than that or a lot better than that. So I think you're quite a statistical community, so I don't need to explain effect sizes here, and I'm even forgetting which one I used when I created this slide. It is quite late here, so moving on swiftly to say that we know that drawing from written text is in most circumstances a good idea. And these are the sorts of drawings I've collected over the years. So I often work in science. I don't invariably work in science education. You'll pick that up from the examples that I've got to hand. But I've spent quite a lot of time in biology, and I've got about 10,000 sketches, drawings, mind maps, tables, graphs, whatever you like, however my learners have interpreted the sentences like. Life depends on the distribution of oxygen, hormone, and nutrients to the cells in all parts of our body. And they'll draw me things like this, or they'll draw me quite memorable and cartoon depictions like this, or they'll draw me things like this, which is one of my favorite drawings of all time, because yes, it's got a combination of spatial depiction having some kind of meaning, and also it's quite arbitrary. You know, obviously this is hormones, this is oxygen, these are nutrients, there's carrot and I guess some kind of lettuce down here are nutrients, and I think we can all see that. So they're saying life depends on oxygen, nutrients and hormones, or else we die. So they're going beyond the information they're given and creating a further explanation of that, but they're also missing out things like the distribution. Another talk on how we assess the quality of sketches and drawings and visualizations. So this kind of thing is fundamental to professional practice. I suspect it is the sort of thing that lots of you do all of the time. So whether we're transforming a mathematical expression into a graph, or a logical expression into an Euler diagram, this kind of transformation, when we take something from one form to another, we find it in the history of science, we find it in philosophy, and we find it everywhere we look in the STEM disciplines. I find it, for example, I've done some work with fashion designers, we find it in fashion design, we find it in geology, because this kind of transformation supports reasoning and problem solving. And this is an example from chemistry, and I apologize for the fact that a lot of these aren't drawings, but I've taken the slide from my friend Melanie Cooper, who's a chemist in the US, although originally from Manchester. And she says to reason about properties, to go from a molecular formula to predict the property of something. There are so many intermediate representations that she goes through in order, certainly as when she's training her beginning organic chemists, to think about the Lewis structures, which allows you to think about electron pair geometry, which allows you to think about space filling molecules, which allows you to think about, oh, I can't remember all of these, but by the time you've transformed these representations from one form to another, you can finally deduce the type and relative strength of the intermolecular forces, and that allows you to predict properties. Now, novices like you and me, unless any of us are chemists on this Zoom tonight, we typically go and try and predict the properties just from the molecular formula, and it doesn't work because we don't have all of these intermediate stages. And experts actually probably don't need to go through all of these intermediate stages because they've internalized them. But for novices, it's really helpful to draw out these transformations in order to predict the properties of representation. And sometimes we can just represent our experiences. Now, so these are quite depictive because this comes from working with kids, but they're not drawing what they see. They were asked to draw the elements of an evaporative phenomena which would happen when somebody would put their hand on wet tissue paper, and then what would happen to the physics of that. And this is one child's drawing, and this is another child's drawing. And here what they're trying to do is imagine the scientific phenomena and re-represent it in a visual form. And finally, when we're thinking about this, why is this so central then to so many practices? Well, I think it allows us to deepen our understanding, to see relationships between ideas. We know that when we construct multiple representations for ourselves, it helps to develop an abstracted understanding, and abstraction can then support generalization and transfer. And actually, certainly in lots of the disciplines, I suspect in lots of your disciplines, and certainly lots of the ones that I study, professional practice is so bound up with understanding and explanations of the purposes of representation that we call this representational competence, that by drawing and redrawing and re-representing, we come to understand not just the representations, but the whole purpose of representation in our field. So if you ever, wander into a chemistry lab and look at what people are doing, they are sketching and visualizing and drawing to explain, to communicate, to excite, to discover. And sometimes they're inventing. So sometimes we invent representations we've never seen before. And I think that's a fabulous and wonderful thing. And one of the neat things that we know is that if you invent a visual representation, or indeed any form of representation, you can invent mathematical formula as well, but I'll stick with the visual for tonight. That if you invent a visual representation for yourself, prior to seeing the canonical one, the one that is the most useful one that the field has decided that helps us understand the world in a new way, a particular type of statistical visualization, a regression line, whatever it is that we're asking people to draw, it doesn't actually matter if they don't invent the right one. We're not trying to get them to guess what it might have taken experts 100 years to work out is the best form. What we know is if we kind of prime them by getting them to invent a visual representation, and then we show them one, they're much more likely to see the affordances and the value of that particular form of visual representation. So we call this, Dan Schwartz and Taylor Martin call it inventing to prepare for future learning. And a similar approach is the approach of productive failure, where you first fail, but that visual form of failing prepares you to learn. So for example, in Back to Quantum Mechanics, a couple of hours later from the examples we've seen to date, we asked people to plot the time function using a 3D representation. Now, they'd not done this before. They'd not seen one in a textbook or a simulation, but they had looked at a complete representation in 2D, or they'd looked at 3D functions just of individual time points. And so we just got so many different sketches of what this mathematical expression should look like. And then we showed them examples in a simulation for them to compare their sketch to. So this is this idea, we don't just have to do it for standard deviations or for simple things or pictures and sketches, we can also do it for really quite complex ideas. And we wouldn't expect people to automatically know how to plot the time function of blah, blah, blah of a 3D representation. Can't remember the physics, should have looked that up again. It's from one of my papers as well, and I can't remember the physics. So what are the criteria for transforming and representing constructing drawing? So what should we be looking for? Well, in this case, we should look for them to transform as much and potentially elaborate from one original form of representation to a new form. So over and over again, people who transform from the first experience or the first representation, the relevant information and elaborate on it, learn more than the people who do not transform much information or don't elaborate. So what we do know is it's very, very difficult for students to do this. So students are representing to learn, but they're also learning to represent as they do this. And it's something that experts often have a blind spot of. We say, okay, here's an equation for predator-prey density. Could you please just look at this phase plot and tell me whether it's the same as this equation? And this is incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. So on the whole, I would say students pretty much always need training or other forms of scaffolding to allow them to learn how to transform and re-represent. And when they're inventing, as I've already said, you don't need to be accurate and you don't need to follow a canonical form when you're inventing to learn. You should try and encapsulate key components of the phenomena that you're doing. And ideally, we're looking for representations that demonstrate what I would call meta-representational competence, which is probably a jargon word that may or may not be familiar in this community, probably won't be, but it might be. So representational competence is the idea that actually, even when we don't know anything about what we're trying to represent, we still have a good idea about what a good representation is. So good representations are parsimonious. They have the right amount of information density. So I saw an example, of somebody putting area under a line graph. Well, that has now 2 dimensions of information when we only needed 1. So we have a kind of sense of representational competence and meta-representational competence. And what we know is if we can help learners develop this, but also even quite young children have quite naive and good meta-representational competence that we can build on if we look for it. And then finally, with invention, we often need to give feedback or we need to provide an expert model. And finally, and I don't have as much to say about this, I'm sure we're all relieved to learn, when learners collaborate by creating a visual representation together, there are so many social processes that are enhanced. We already know that when you collaborate around a shared visual representation, you can gesture at it, you can point to it. So if you don't have the same language, it doesn't matter. We know that it supports externalizing cognition, we know it supports communication, but when we draw together, something even more unique happens. So now we have to discuss and agree any changes we are making, because we have to externalize our own knowledge for our collaborator to work with, and we also have to elicit their viewpoints as well. And then we have to create a visual representation that enables a new understanding that encompasses all of the viewpoints of the peers that we've been working with. And this new understanding is often being made more salient by being made more explicit. So this is a very neat area of research, and I don't think it gets quite as much of attention as it should. I can give you some references to people who work in this area. I've just published a book chapter on collaboration and creating visualizations together. But I'll just give you a couple of examples. So some very early work by Dan Schwartz, again, was giving people constraint satisfaction problems where they were trying to work out what should be the properties of a pond such that different kinds of fish could live in it. I mean, it was just a logic puzzle, really. It wasn't a biology puzzle. And what he found was that when people collaborated, they didn't necessarily make better solutions to the problem. They didn't necessarily create new insights. What they did when they collaborated, they created representations that were more abstract. So they had to become abstract in order to encompass the viewpoints of the collaborating peers. So this might be, and this is the work by Simon Garrod, so he suggests that this kind of process is how we first turn from kind of turning pictorial systems of communication into symbolic language in the first place. So he says this kind of form of abstraction where things become repurposed because you now have to see them away from an individual's viewpoint explains some of the shift we have seen in so many languages from being pictorial informed to being phonological and abstract, which is a very interesting thesis if he is right. And I'm certainly prepared to go along with it. And there's some lovely studies looking at basically playing Pictionary with people. And if you play Pictionary with somebody, if you're allowed to interact with them and get feedback, the representations you create for a phenomena become more and more abstract over time. But if you don't get feedback, if you don't interact, they stay concrete. So I think this is a kind of interesting work. And finally, and I'm just going to end on this kind of final example, just because I think you probably don't get many storybooks in your data visualization sessions. So worked with my PhD student, Julia Gelmini-Hornsby. What we presented young kids, this like 5 or 6 year olds, with storybooks to tell stories around. And this is a very famous storybook. But in addition to just looking at the story and telling stories, they were given visualization tools to enhance their storytelling practices. And what we found that when they did that, they gestured more, they talked more, and they created more interesting stories that were better in terms of a story form, but also engaged their learners who remembered them better as well. And we also see this in kind of scientific visualization as well. So sometimes just, creating a visualization helps engage others with what we're saying. Success criteria for interactive drawing change again. So if we're going to work with peers now, things like clarity and labeling become much more important because we need to understand each other's perspective. If we're going to collaborate, then these have to express our current understanding and serve as the basis for mutual development. And some of the things we think we know is if we are going to ask learners to create a shared visual representation, they may often need to start by creating an individual drawing before subsequently merging them. There isn't as much research in this as some of the other areas, but that certainly seems to be one of the suggestions. If we want to make this sharing effective, start with an individual drawing and then come together. So that was 9 different reasons to draw, separated into 3 different camps with different emphases underlying them in terms of attention and short-term memory and engagement and effect, but all of them involving culture and social processes to some extent, and to every extent, and all of them, there's a reason why we communicate through visual representations way back to their specificity and memory benefits as well. So I never see them as competing, I always see them as complementary. So I've got a slide here now of questions. So these are things that people often ask me. So I thought I would give you some answers to them. I can also wrap up if you would prefer, but I'll just keep going until somebody gives me a thumbs up or down. So briefly, should we always draw visualizations? Is that what I'm arguing? And I am not arguing that. There are certain times when language is the best choice, verbal or written language. When we need to express abstractions and negations, then, when we need to make salient things, we often need to use verbal. And sometimes we shouldn't be trying to use 2D, we should be trying to model in 3D or gesture in 4D. Are all drawings as good as one another? I don't think I need to tell you that. I've already seen your talks that a lot of the time you're trying to find the best drawing, the best diagram, the best visualization for the situation at hand. So although I put a lot of emphasis on construction, I don't think that it's arbitrary what you construct. Sometimes a particular thing to construct is going to be better than another thing to construct. I often get asked, do I have to be good at drawing to learn by drawing? So can everybody draw to learn? And I think pretty much yes. For many of those purposes that I've gone through today, drawing skills are irrelevant. An abstract square with 4 lines to it, indicating where the valves are on a heart, will tell you about the functional architecture of a heart, and it does not need to look like a heart. But actually, there may be some other cases where potentially the ability to draw well may be important. So if you draw something badly, it could potentially reify a bad model in your mind. So there might be situations of 3-dimensional complexity where getting that faithful and accurate is important. That might mean that drawing skills could become important in a very few certain set of circumstances. In medical school, people often take a drawing skills course in order to help them in their anatomy, I have found. Do people need support to draw to learn? Yes, indeed they do. Well, I think we can all kind of draw a quick sketch of a mnemonic. Again, lots of things I'm talking about today. First of all, we've taken drawing and sketching and visual expression out of our primary and secondary curriculums over most of the world. It does vary. So there's more emphasis in Asia still in drawing in primary secondary curriculum than there is in the US or the UK. So we've certainly stopped doing it, and that's a bit of a shame. But I do think on the whole, I'm still not talking about making something beautiful here or faithful. I am mostly talking about learning how to express your understanding in a visual form. So that's about representational competence. It's about knowing the affordances of a particular form of drawing for your purpose. And it's about learning how effortful it might be to do that. So I heard another talk that in your series talking about minimizing effort. And I think this is different. When people draw to learn, we need to make it be the right kind of effort. So sometimes drawing can even act as a speed bump to slow learners down and force them to pay attention. I've only talked about drawing here today as a tool for the learner, but actually teachers can draw, instructors can draw. It's one of the things that's possibly a shame that we all use PowerPoint these days, so we no longer draw on a whiteboard in front of our students in the way that was, the only choice 40 years ago. And there's a whole other talk on the value of getting learners to express their understanding in visual form for assessment. Not only does it reveal things about their conceptions that they may be able to say intramolecular bonding or intermolecular bonding, but they may not know what it means. And if they have to draw hydrogen bonding, then we can see that. But also it sends the wrong epistemology often of a discipline if we just give them a multiple choice test and ask them to tick a box. Professional practice is so often about the construction of visual representation for yourself. And if we don't assess that, then learners don't learn to do it. So I think it's really vital. And I do think, segueing into my last point, digital tools will change this again. You know, we've ended the era of the GUI. We're now in the era of the NUI. And these natural user interfaces are going to allow us to draw more directly again. So it's going to make some things better. So we can do drawing-based modeling, we can draw to program, we can draw visualizations and iterate on them really, really quickly now, and that is all wonderful. But I'll probably say there's still some value to picking up a pen and paper and an envelope and sketching sometimes. So we shouldn't always throw the pen and paper away. And at the moment, the meta-analyses are mixed as to whether pen and paper drawing is to be preferred in certain circumstances over digital drawing. But I think the digital tools themselves are changing so rapidly, it's probably not worth placing too much faith in these meta-analyses at the moment. So that was me. That is my take-home message. I think that drawing a visualization for yourself is a fabulous thing to do for so many different reasons. Thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat bigger.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Many people's screens are closed, but I bet people are clapping. If you're able to react, you can react using the Zoom reactions. Yep, thank you. Yeah, just want to highlight that Shaaron started her day like almost 12 hours ago. She's very excited to...
15 hours ago, 15 and a half, maybe 16 hours ago now.
That's right. But yeah, joining us from the UK, and it's really excited to get people's reactions to what we just went over. So without further ado, I'm going to share the first question from the chat. People were wondering, so Beth and Vicky were wondering about how these approaches apply to verbal subjects such as law or history or political science or language learning.
Who says they're verbal? I think I'd say. So yeah, I was reading some absolutely fascinating paper by a group in Sweden last week about how the way that we represent time in timelines changes our understanding of history or politics so dramatically. So I apologize in that I often work with scientists, and so many of my examples are drawn from science, but there's a lot of work in history and politics around drawing visualization. So I don't think there's anything specifically unique. I haven't actually come across anything in law, but that's probably just because I haven't looked. So what I was saying earlier about abstractions, I think we will see things like law and history and go for these abstractions more frequently, but I still think there'll be lots of reasons to draw to, you know, focus our attention, draw to help us remember, draw to transform. And yeah, the paper I was reading on timelines, I can send to Cameron and he can send it out if anybody wants. It was from a group at Linköping, but I thought it was absolutely fabulous just how they were showing how time and how we represented time changed our understanding of history and politics. So I think it works the same. Oh, my first cat. I've seen a cat. Hooray! Mine's banned currently, otherwise he would already be here. Does anybody, Beth, does that answer your question, or do you want to jump in and expand, or is that good enough? I can maybe move on.
Yeah, I can
Valerie?
add a small comment there. There's some research around applying the approaches that we use in software dependency graph analysis. So drawing like which programs talk to which other programs, but applying that to the legal system to see which clauses are dependent on other clauses. So perhaps that could be an interesting area to explore as well.
Send me them. I like to collect them. I like to collect really good examples, but then, as you will see quite late at night, I then forget the underlying discipline. My ability to remember the quantum mechanics is absolutely shocking. And I worked on that project for 2 years. So would I say that drawing is a factor of learning as subset, writing as learning, writing has been shown to increase recall, or that they're separate or unrelated? So I think what I'm being asked here is drawing and writing the same as a way of helping you recall something? So I think that some of this is about the act of construction. So if you construct something, be that a written language or a drawing, there's going to be some things that are similar and shared because you're expressing your understanding, you're writing it down. That's going to have some things in common because it's a similar constructive activity. But I think that drawing a visual spatial representation, so something where position and space is meaningful, is going to have different and distinct differences to writing. And I think it's for all those reasons, but the ones that most stand out when we're looking at recall are specificity. So if you have to draw something, you have had to make so many more commitments to it than if you have to write something. And also, I think it's going to have, so our understanding of how memory works has, changed so much over the last 10 to 15 years, where we very much know that memory is a reconstructive process where we're not just kind of dumping from our brain something that we've experienced in the form that we experienced it, but every single episode of remembering is it in itself an act of reconstruction. So when we reconstruct something in a visual form, it's going to involve so many more cognitive and motor processes, which would be predicted to enhance recall. And indeed, in pretty much all of the studies that have looked at, there's a paper in Current Directions in Psychological Science, if you can get to it, by Fernandez and others, that reviewed about 20 or 30 separate studies, all of which found that drawing aids recall. How it works in language learning. I have never looked at drawing to learn languages. I have looked at drawing for visual, I've looked at language learning with visual representation. I'm going to say again, it's probably not unique. Language learning, particularly if we're looking at second language learning, is probably going to be relatively similar in terms of the properties of drawing and what they do and how they help you focus attention and memory and how they involve motor components and gesturing. First language learning, so learning in L1, that's, we're getting to a developmental question here now, and I've stayed away from development today. But actually there's a very large developmental psychology around drawing and how children learn to draw up to about the age of 5. So I'm going to say that I do not know enough about the intersection of language learning and children's ability to draw and even understand a drawing as a representation. So up to about 2.5 to 3, for example, if you show children a photograph of a room and you show them on this photograph that there's sweets hidden under a cushion, and then you let them into the room, they won't think to look under the cushion, because the photograph is a photograph and the room is a room. So they don't understand that a representation is a representation of something until they start to get to about 2.5 to 3-ish, give or take. So I'm going to say for L1, I don't know. I think it will be a more complex thing to talk about, unless anybody's got a better answer on the call than that.
I think that's probably a good starting point for us to think about.
And I guess most of you don't have to worry about 2.5 to 3-year-olds in your professional life, but in your personal life, it's good fun to get them to draw. Joyce, how does artistic ability play into all of this? Yeah, oh no, yes, that's lovely. So I have sort of talked a little bit about drawing artistic ability towards my frequently asked questions at the end. But one thing I didn't talk about was drawing anxiety. And actually drawing anxiety is a really real phenomena. In the area of writing, we know an awful lot about writing self-efficacy and writing anxiety. And we know that really gets in the way of children's learning to express themselves. And we know that we have to not just have to work on the perceptual, motor and cognitive components of writing, but we also have to work on self-efficacy and writing anxiety. And for drawing, there is very little published work on drawing anxiety. There is no well-validated scale of drawing anxiety like there is for writing anxiety. But as somebody who asks people to draw as a way of learning, I would say drawing anxiety is off the scale compared to writing anxiety. Every now and again, you know, I wander into a lecture room, I've got 100 students in front of me, and halfway through a lecture, I'll ask them to draw something they've understood from this lecture. And about 3 students look at me as if I am the lecturer they have been waiting for the whole of their lives. 70 of them are on their phone and aren't listening to me, and 20 of them are glaring at me as if I have just ruined their day. So absolutely, I do, you know, I hear I can't draw, so I can't draw to learn more than anything else. And that's one of the reasons I try and talk about, it's not about the artistic features of a drawing or a sketch. It's about how much you transform and represent something and externalize the key features of what you're trying to visualize. And it could be that certain kinds of data tools coming along will help people like me, because I very much can't draw curtains. I'm a very poor drawer, which is embarrassing given all of this research. I'll skip the next 2 comments because they're questions, but I will thank you very much for them. Yes, I will share the timeline paper. I'm sorry, I can't share it in the chat right now, but I will send it to Cameron, who can send it on. Have you ever found doodles to be destructive towards learning when poor assumptions are made? For example, the fork was actually on the other side of the knife, and this causes a physical impossibility when you learn more information. So yes, I think, so there are some concerns about what happens if we reify the wrong model by externalizing and making more salient something. And I'm not going to say there is very clear-cut evidence for that happening one way or the other, but it's certainly something that I worry about. So it's certainly something that I think about, therefore advising people when not to try and draw. So I do some work with medical schools, as you've seen, And some of the time, we talk about doing gesturing or doing modeling instead, because we think that the 2D drawings aren't helpful here. And actually, one of the things, I was talking to a surgeon once, and he said he was very reluctant to draw tumors for his patients when he was trying to explain to them where he thought a tumor was, say, in breast tissue, because he had a very good sense of uncertainty. And I'm sure this is a community that understands the problems with representing uncertainty in visualizations, that you can do it, but it is not easy. And so he was very reluctant to draw certain things, because he didn't want to leave a high fidelity representation that was too concrete in his patient's mind. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. So I think there might be situations where we don't want to go for high fidelity visual representations, but I would probably say in many situations we could go for a less concrete and more abstract form of visual spatial representation. And we probably really still do need to think about better ways to visualize uncertainty. And you are probably a better community for doing that than I. Oh, tail waving, I do like that cat. Vicky, yes. Vicky, there almost certainly is on this, and I do not know it. So I've only ever worked in the area of language learning once, and that was a very different project when I was looking at eye tracking and looking at how learners may or may not, second language learners may or may not reference pictures on a page with text. So I've not looked at it, and I therefore should not speculate outside my area of expertise. But I think drawing can be really helpful. So it would surprise me if there weren't circumstances where, for all those reasons, it would be a good idea to do it. I often draw on chemists, not least because first I did a degree in chemistry myself, but I've actually remarkable thing of all of it ever since. I think my cognitive science ate my chemistry, but I do work with chemists quite a lot because they are just fascinating. They are such a visual profession when you get them to invent representations. So I love studying chemists, and yeah, they are fun for me to play with, chemists. Also, I can normally manage their visualizations if I have to draw them myself, unlike the geologists and the fashion designers that I work with. I think the next two are more comments. What got me into this field or subject? So I did a master's degree in AI, and I looked at creating visual representations and multiple representations for learners. And for the next 15 years, I studied the affordances of combining representations to help people learn. So what happens when you combine a text with a graphic? What happens when you combine a table with an expression, with a function graph? What happens when you combine a haptic representation of force feedback with a three-dimensional representation of protein-ligand interaction? And then one day I'd had enough of that, and for the last 15 years, I've basically been asking people to draw so many different forms of visual representation, but I am singularly unsuccessful at getting funding for this. Although I believe this is an area of important academic work, funders on the whole, certainly UK funders, tend to disagree with me. So one day I will persuade them, because I am doing another deep dive back into data science to look at visual representation and serious games. And maybe this time I will convince them that drawing and data science are things that go together. But how would you hope data visualization people would use my research? I think that implicitly you are using these kind of things all of the time. And I think all I'm trying to do is step back and think about why we're doing these kind of practices, and sort of think to ourselves, when should we be asking learners to draw with us? When should we ask them to draw prior to seeing some of the data visualizations that I might be creating and showing? Because if I ask them to invent something prior to seeing my best one that is much better than they could come up with for themselves, when does that initial act of drawing for themselves help prepare them to learn from this new one? So I guess I would say it might help think about how we might sequence the data visits that you guys are creating. And then I know that many of you have either side interests or core interests in teaching data visualization. And hopefully this kind of approach, just perhaps it protects us from looking for too simple an answer. So there are people out there who are going to give you 2 perfect drawings or 5 principles. And if you use these principles, everything will be okay. And a lot of that is honed wisdom. And I think that's probably quite valuable, because people can't spend their lives doing what I do and reading, every academic paper that I can on this topic. So often, these kind of boiled down principles are quite useful summaries of stuff that people have intuited and learned over the years. But actually also, I think there can be benefits to stepping back every now and again and thinking, well, why? What is it about our species and how we interact with visual representations that is special? And I hope this kind of approach helps us think about what is going on when we do this kind of stuff. So I hope that's enough of an answer. Yes, physicists are visual, Beth, but you have to persuade them of that. So I when I'm doing some initial teacher education, I walk into another room. I've got 150 training science teachers in this room, and I put up a biology thing to draw, I put up a chemistry thing to draw, and I put up something about intermolecular forces for the chemists. I put up some kind of cardiovascular thing for the biologists, and I put up some acceleration, velocity, force, Newtonian situation for the physicists. And what's interesting is different disciplines draw in very different ways. So the biologists are looking for faithful depictions. They reach for the colored pencils. Physicists jump for the abstractions a lot quicker. They don't understand what the colored pencils are doing on the desk mostly. They're completely happy with black and white. And when the work that I've done with Gina Passant and Antje Knoll, which is the quantum stuff, and they are the physicists, not I, most of the world has found that most of the sciences and the social sciences have found that people find translating a visual representation to a drawing more difficult than going from a visual form to writing. Physicists seem to be quite an exception to that statement. So physicists seem to be reluctant sometimes to transform from a visual back to words in our experience. And I've just written a paper with Gina and Antje for, it's open access, this one, for Physics Educational Review, looking at representational competence in physics. If you go into Google Scholar and if you just stick Shaaron into the internet, because of the 2 A's, the chances are you're going to stumble across these papers. So they're on Google Scholar. If you can't find somewhere free to get them, just email me and I'll send you a preprint or something. So yeah, physicists draw, but in my experience, they draw differently, and sometimes they are reluctant. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Sally. Can you share an example of an affordance or a scaffolding guideline that made for an effective versus a less effective drawing? Yes, I can, but I'm worried they're going to be a bit too far away from your data viz mainstream. So if I say around, so first of all, I would say active drawing, constructive drawing, and interactive drawing probably have very different types of scaffolding and very different types of affordances and guidelines. So let's stay in my happy place of the transformational one where you are transforming something from one form to another. So I have done studies myself. Katerina Scheidt has done some. Peggy Van Meter has done some. Assuming this is being recorded, and so those words will be accessible later. And what we typically find is that, first of all, we need to help people take drawing seriously. So we have to deal with the anxiety, and then we have to deal with this is silly and I'm too grown up to draw. So we first of all have to get themselves into the right affective space. And then most of the advice becomes around how do you encapsulate or elaborate key elements of the phenomena that you want to transform. So it's about close selection of the original form, and then it's about extrapolating, building in your prior knowledge and what you're currently developing into a new form. And therefore, most of the time, I haven't been in this work sort of saying, oh, and it would be better to do this as a histogram rather than a pie chart, because we're not interested in proportional reasoning here. We're interested in absolute reasoning, although there is work that has done that, you know, Barbara Tversky or would be a name that would spring to my mind, and obviously Colin Ware and lots of people in your community as well, and Ben Schneiderman and people at the intersection set of our community. But for me, it has often been about, because I haven't been looking for canonical form, it has been saying to people, the more you effortlessly transform and then re-inspect your drawing, the better you will learn. So that's a little bit vague, but perhaps that gives you some kind of feeling.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
In my work, so Philippa, in my work, I struggle to show my concern of turning our communication in general into a more visual form, including visual elements in the case of simple text. I wonder if the impact of technology could be measured in terms of how much more impact visualizations have versus text. That's an interesting thought. So I'm going to just ramble a bit, and every now and again I might say something that's slightly relevant to that question. So we absolutely know that we are becoming more visual. So if we look at things like science textbooks over the last 40 or 50 years, the amount of space on a page that is given to visual forms relative to words is massively increasing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's increasing to include the right kind of visual representations. So a lot of those are now photographs. And a lot of those photographs are not necessarily doing anything other than being decorative, or even passing something called the thumb test. Do you guys know of the thumb test? So the thumb test is when buyers wander into a book fair, and they wander up to Pearson or whatever publisher is there, and they flick through, you know, the various science textbooks on offer to see which would be relevant to their school curriculum or their state standards. And the thumb test is something that feels visually appealing in that moment. And unfortunately, photographs do that really well. And I'm not going to say that I never would want to use a photograph, but one of the things that we know, again, and haven't had time to talk about this, but photographs can be seductive details. So they can invite us into the wrong space. Sometimes they can make us think we've understood something when we haven't, or they can take us into the wrong schema. So I'm not a huge fan of visual representations purely for decorative form in these situations. I really like them to have a functional form as well as look good and act well. So to some extent, and now of course we've got e-textbooks and we've got simulations and we've got augmented realities and visual realities. And so now the amount of space and attention being given to visual and graphical representations in these new forms of media is increasing all the time. But I still don't think we're teaching it. So we've covered the world in visual representations, but we're not explaining, we're not teaching graphicacy or representational competence or meta-representational competence successfully in our school systems. You know, when we look at policy documents, they're often covered in representations simply for their decorative form and something that was initially created to have meaning. And, you know, I am sure we have all spent a lot of time looking at a COVID-19 virion representation in the last 18 months. And, you know, those representations were originally created to have real meaning by the CDC with labels and explanations, where the fact that color was arbitrary and the size of the number of protein membranes was arbitrary. All of this was very clear in the original visual label, so the original label that went with this original form. But what's happened is it's been picked up and it is now floating around in space such that children think it's about this size, because this is the size it's presented on their TV screen. And we already know that they think viruses are the same size as small insects to start with. And they think that protein spikes are red. And that's why they can, you know, get in our blood and infect us. So, as I said, I'm going to ramble in the general vicinity of your question and hope that I've answered enough of it to get by. She hopes. Philippa, so it would be learning not by drawing, but by absorbing drawing, if we could say it this way. Could framing attract more funding? Would definitely be interested. I don't know how to frame this to attract more funding. And if you have the magic answer, this is something every academic on the planet would like to know. I am singularly unsuccessful in persuading the UK policymakers to take visual representation seriously in our when I do research around education. I've had actually slightly more success with US-based funders, but recently relationships across the Atlantic have not been positive enough for me to sup from the National Science Foundation pool, sadly. But I'm always up for that. So it, I don't know. I mean, drawing, so sometimes I try different words. So sketching, constructing visual representation, graphicacy, still can't persuade them. Data visualization, maybe you guys, maybe I should just talk a little bit more about visualization. Because just at the periphery of my consciousness, people like to get stuck into camps and labels, and they say, oh, I'm a scientific visualizer, not a data visualizer. And then I think I don't understand the difference between those. So I'm not altogether certain that I could pull off data visualization, but yes, I am definitely going to put in data science. I have come to that conclusion myself recently. Going to get out some of my AI, which I'm rarely using at the moment. And a good visualization requires a lot of thought and work. I could not agree more. I absolutely think it does. And I think that for learners, if we're directing that energy in the right way, that's exactly the right thought and work that I want them to do. So, you know, when I'm talking about games and developing games, I talk about serious, effortful play. And I think designing a visualization can be very similar. It should be serious, effortful play. That feels like a good thing to end on, Cameron. What do you think?
I think so too. If we can have another round of applause for Shaaron for staying late with us and joining us. This has been extremely inspiring. I think this reminder that when we're drawing, we're not just like looking for simple answers, but really engaging with the work is very key to being able to understand the topic, whatever it is. So thank you so much. There have been a number of links that were discussed. We'll share them to the Meetup page afterwards. And hopefully this is just the start of many future conversations about drawing to learn and how we visualize our data. Naomi, is there anything else that you'd like to add? You're muted. Let me unmute you. We can't hear you yet.
I thought I unmuted. Sorry about that. I want to thank Cameron once again for hosting us. And I want especially to thank Shaaron for her outstanding talk. From the comments, you can see how much it was appreciated. And we cannot thank you enough for accepting this very late time and for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you all for attending. And with that, I'll say good night.